Keir Starmer won election to become leader of the Labour Party, but does he now preside over the Landlord Party? To discuss that question, I'm joined by Aaron Bastani and Ash Sarkar. How are you both doing?
Doing good, although that was a bit of a laboured pun, if you ask me, Michael.
There's no way that you can put landlord into another sentence, is there?
Not
so
really,
I was just whatever. Aaron, how are you doing?
I'm great. No, I'm not great. I mean, the Labour Party is a real shit show. We'll talk about that more over the course of the show. There's other stuff going on, of course, but my God, it's terrible.
The Labour Party being a shit show is only going to be one of our topics tonight. We are also going to talk about the government, also a shit show, kicking out the homeless, and their failure to build a test and trace system before loosening the lockdown. And we'll also speak to James McCash, a primary school teacher and Labour councillor, about the current standoff over when and how Britain will open its schools. As ever, tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour and share the link because we want to get more people watching this show live. So, we spoke on Monday's show about Labour adopting a terrible policy on rent arrears. Under Corbyn's leadership, the party had pledged to support rent forgiveness. But now, under Starmer, the Labour Party have committed only to giving renters 2 years to pay off their arrears in full. We've discussed why that's a terrible idea in the middle of a global recession. Making people pay more than their already extortionate rent sucks demand out of the system and is incredibly inequitable. In any case, the story developed this week because Thangham Debbonaire, who is the housing minister, spoke to a young Fabian's Zoom call yesterday and defended the policy. So we're going to take a look at that now.
So the policy called Cancel the Rent is actually surprisingly un-Labour. It's a really regressive policy because, for instance, there are people who are still in work, still able to pay their rent. And if you just cancelled rent, they would also benefit and they don't need to. For instance, I have a flat in London, which all MPs who don't live in London, we have rented accommodation in London, it would cancel my rent. Now, that would be completely unnecessary, really regressive, not necessary at all, and not targeted on the people who need it the most. And if you take out the entire private rented sector and you cancelled its rent, in fact, if you took out the entire rented sector and you cancelled its rent, we're talking about £7.2 billion a month. Now, just for comparison, that's less than we're spending on the National Health Service a month, but not much. So, we're talking about an enormous amount of money. If you also cancel the rent and you didn't compensate the landlords, social landlords like councils and housing associations, some of them would go bust. Most of them would have to stop building and stop. Well, I mean, they're not building much at the moment anyway, but they would have no money for building. They would have no money for maintenance.
So these are all terrible arguments, all of them. And they're all quite right-wing arguments as well. So the first point to say it's un-Labour. It's un-Labour because people who don't need it will benefit. That's just the principle of universalism. So the NHS is not un-Labour because rich people get to have free operations when potentially they could afford it. Now, also, we're not saying that necessarily we should cancel everyone's rent. That's a bit of a straw man. But the idea that a universal policy makes it un-Labour, ridiculous. Second, talking about the cost. So as I've just said, the only option here, that the alternative to the policy of renters paying back arrears in full in the middle of a global recession isn't the state paying everyone's rent for 2 years. There are many other options, as we talked about on Monday's show. The New Economics Foundation have talked about having a mortgage holiday and a rental holiday, and then using the state to sort of make sure this doesn't crash the financial system, et cetera, et cetera. My biggest problem, though, there about the cost was the way she was talking about it, right? So she was saying this would be almost as big as the NHS budget. So we can't do it because, if we were to do this policy, we'd basically be giving up all of this money that could have gone to the NHS. And that kind of zero-sum argument is really reactionary. So let's look at how much the NHS does cost every month. So the NHS costs £11 billion per month. The furlough scheme, which the government just introduced to pay people 80% of their wages to not go into work, costs £14 billion a month. So would Thangham Debbonaire have opposed that? Are we to the right of the Tory party now? This idea of presenting one social policy against another social policy and saying we can't afford this because we want to do that when you're in the middle of a global recession, and what we need is ambitious demand side policies which boost the economy and allow it to continue without driving us into a depression. This is not how people on the Labour front bench should be talking about the economy. And finally, how unimaginative do you have to be to think that if there was some sort of rent cancellation policy, there would be no possible other way for housing associations and local councils to be able to do up their buildings? What about a grant? I mean, if what you want to do is take over the state, and you can't imagine a possible way that a housing estate would be able to pay to do itself up, or a council would be able to build new buildings whilst people not paying back their rent arrears in full, I don't know. Why did you go into that job? I'm sorry. Ash, I know you have strong feelings about this as well.
Well, Thangham Debbonaire has very kindly advised that I join the Communist Party instead of the Labour Party, which is very strange because actually I do find myself in that tradition of none other than Keir Hardie, one of the founders of the Labour Party, who in 1915 supported a rent strike in Glasgow. So he was unavailable for comment, obviously, on this particular matter about whether that action of his was un-Labour. And you do sort of wonder, you know, what would Thangham Debbonaire have made of the NHS when it was founded in 1945? Would he have been going up to NIBEV and going, I can actually pay for my own lobotomy, thank you very much. I don't think we should set up this universal healthcare system in case someone who can pay for their healthcare, you know, ends up with a free amputation or something. That's utterly ridiculous. The Labour Party, before it became obsessed with means testing, kind of in that post-Thatcher era, was actually very much in favour of universalism, not just because it was a very efficient way to roll out huge public services, but also because it created a sense of social bonds and togetherness and collective buy-in. But one thing that I want to say about the specific issue about Thangham's rent, that she said that it's a really regressive policy because she has a flat in London, which all MPs who don't live in London have, and a policy for a rent freeze would cancel her rent, and that would be really very regressive. Now, I entirely agree that there should be some consistency about high earners paying rent or not, which is why I find it so cheeky that in the tax year 2018 to 2019, Thangham Debbonaire claimed £19,500 to cover the rent on this flat in London. Now, there's nothing improper going on here. It's entirely within the rules. I just think it's funny as fuck that someone who has their rent covered by the taxpayer for their London pad is turning around to the rest of us and going, well, that's fine for me and not for you, really. It's regressive for you, but not for me. And on this question of, you know, well, why is this sort of 2 years to pay for arrears so bad, is that the Labour Party is not grappling with the scale of the kind of economic crisis that we're facing. So in their mind, there's going to be a steep rise in unemployment, but that's going to even out relatively quickly. That's not going to be the only way in which economic pain is being felt. People are going to have their hours reduced. People who don't have guaranteed hours at the moment might find them slide to zero. So you're going to need to do something about this huge reduction in income across the board. And you can't just say this means that we have to support unemployed people, which are already terrible, by the way, are going to kick in and be enough. I found the lack of serious engagement with this new economics foundation policy really bizarre, really incurious. And it's easy to sort of hold Thangham Debbonaire up as an individual and say, this is all her. But there is such thing as cabinet collective responsibility. And so with those, you know, MPs who make up that shadow cabinet, who consider themselves to be on the left of the party, I want them to be kicking up a stink about this. Put your money where your mouth is.
I'm going to go to Aaron in one moment, but first I want to watch a second part of that video, which I think shows the paucity of ambition of the Labour front bench on this particular issue.
If we had that policy and a lot of private landlords went bust, I know there are lots of people, including lots of Labour members, who go, yippee, that's fine. They're evil, exploitative people, which is maybe well be true. But if they go bust, their tenants are going to be homeless. Yeah. You know, so we have to think about what would happen after that. Their housing that they owned would be bought up by probably even greedier landlords. And I think we also have to think about the fact that sometimes, whether we like it or not, people who've been on low pay, often for the last 10 years as a result of terrible Tory cuts, are topping up a very mediocre income with rent on a property that used to belong to their mother, who's maybe moved in with them, and they're renting out their mom's house, and that is actually topping up their income.
I mean, it's such a stupid argument because it's what you're doing. It's a really classic right-wing way of doing an argument, which is to say, if we changed this one thing and didn't change anything else, there'd be some bad policies, so we can't do this one thing,
Yeah.
right? And also, no one really is suggesting in these plans that we're going to intentionally bankrupt a load of landlords. It's probably not particularly, it's not going to be particularly politically popular in the middle of a global pandemic. But if you were, so if you hypothesize that some landlords go bust, then the only thing that Thangham Debbonaire can possibly imagine you would do if landlords go bust is you'd sit back while worse landlords buy up the property. Now, we have a secular crisis of social housing in this country. And how could it not sort of, even pass your mind that maybe the state could buy up those houses when they're presumably going to be a bit cheaper at this point in time, and then rent them out at social rents? Like that's not rocket science, is it? And also this idea that, yeah, some people do rely on their rental property to have some income if they're not getting well enough paid, is what she's saying there. Well, how about we build a welfare system where people don't need to own a second home to retire comfortably? And it's they want to take over the state. They can change more than one policy. I mean, I just find it so frustrating, Aaron.
The whole interview was ridiculous. She didn't know what starter homes are, which is obviously a very controversial policy. She said things like, oh, the left has to get with the program. Working class people want to own their own homes. No shit. I've been renting for, 16 years. I've lived in about 15 houses and flats. Yeah, thank you for telling me. By the way, your party, the previous leadership, promised to build 500,000 private homes in 5 years had it won the last general election. It's just almost mocking people with the exact same platitudes we heard 5 years ago. They were unpopular then, they're unpopular now. And she says, on the one hand, oh, well, this would cost us, £6-7 billion a month. And then immediately she says, and also we'd bankrupt landlords. It's going to be one or the other, right? Either you have a system where the state comes in and pays these rents. Nobody is suggesting that, like you say, Michael. And if they are suggesting it, it's for maybe several months. And they're not suggesting that. They're certainly not. Nobody is suggesting it for 2 years. I said on Monday, the fact that people are throwing up this straw man demonstrates how weak this policy is. And at the same time, the thing about, oh, well, if they go out of business, somebody worse will come along. A capitalist in a crisis like this, they look at things called distressed assets. And by the way, we could see if this crisis then becomes a crisis of the mortgage market, if we see house values drop. I mean, they may not. The FT is saying right now that UK housing will fall by 5 to 15%. 5% is negligible. 15% is pretty significant. In that context, yeah, we should be talking about the state buying up distressed assets, i.e. houses which people are having to sell because all of a sudden the numbers don't add up anymore, or because renters are defaulting and people with buy-to-let mortgages are screwed. Yes, actually, the state should be stepping in and buying them because, like you say, we have a decades-long crisis of social housing. Labour, whether it's the centre, the right, the left, all accept there's a problem with regards to housing in this country. Surely the one time you would want to buy houses is when they're massively undervalued and distressed in a crisis. When would be a better time to do it? And I just found the whole thing exasperating. And then, okay, yeah, maybe 1 in 1,000 landlords is in the situations he's talking about. You don't base policy around the 0.01% of people. That's not how you build good policy. It's like, for instance, if I say to my dad, we need to transform the economy, we need socialism, he might say, well, this one guy who had no money is now a millionaire, and so everybody can do it. No, you don't build a social system. You don't legitimate a social system around this one person in 10,000. It's stupid. It's childlike. And what was most concerning is, well, I didn't really rate John Healey as her predecessor, sort of, had the brief for housing, but he knew what he was talking about. And what is petrifying with Labour is that somebody is admitting they don't really know that much about the brief, is talking in platitudes, says, well, I don't have the civil service, I just have one researcher, I can't come up with real meaningful policy, in a context of a pandemic, in a context of the worst recession in 300 years. And many, many people, whether it's homeowners or whether it's people who are renting, being very unsure about their future. Why the hell would you elevate somebody into that position when they've got no familiarity with the brief at this moment? It's politically inastute, but also I think it's deeply unethical.
Ash, I mean, I think the thing that frustrates me so much is that this is actively shifting the Overton window to the right. We are in a world now where the Tories are considering policies which are way more interventionist than they ever would have done before, and Labour is actively saying like, "Oh no, I wouldn't do that. Oh, that sounds like a bad idea. Oh, couldn't possibly do that." Sorry, I brought you in, Ash, and then I made my own point. But what what are you saying?
But like you should, because I'm infuriated by this. I'm completely infuriated by this, because there's actually a huge groundswell of public opinion for people to be able to defer on their rent payments and their mortgage payments in order to cover more immediate costs, like, I don't know, feeding your kids. The fact that Labour's policy has moved in a direction not even of incremental change, right? Not even of inadequate change, but of propping up a completely dysfunctional rental market and fixing the price at a level that already huge numbers of people up and down the country are struggling to pay, to me seems to be completely bananas. And one of the things that I go back to again and again is that rent is a huge generational transfer in wealth. Now, that's not to say that all renters are young and all landlords are old, but it's generally a huge generational transfer in wealth. 1 in 5 baby boomers is a millionaire, and many of them, doubled the value of their assets in the decade following the financial crisis. So, at this period of real stagnation of incomes, you have this huge, debt inflated value of assets, which is concentrated in a particular age group. And that means that people of our age, people who are a bit older, and also people who are much younger, are completely locked out of, 1, the housing market, and 2, are having to spend ever increasing portions of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. And Thangham Debbonaire could have said, you know what, I don't have the policy answer right now. I don't have the policy answer right now, but I'm going to start from this position about this generational transfer of wealth. I'm going to start from this position of young people going to be particularly vulnerable to this crisis because they don't have an asset like a house to fall back on and fast running out of savings. And that's how I'm going to start thinking about what my policy about renting should be. Instead, she made it this ideological fight between the preservation of private property rights against an imagined socialist horde, which, I don't know, just seems to be 3 leftist shit posters and Aaron Bastani on the internet. If that. And a consultation with landlords. And what you've ended up with is an actually regressive policy. And meanwhile, she's spinning her wheels trying to come up with, justifications for it after the fact. And there is no disguising the fact that this is really bad politics. It is in complete denial about the scale of the economic crisis that's coming. And it's also, taken a look at, the strong electoral support that Labour does enjoy, even after December's spanking at the ballot box, and going, you know what, I'm just going to shoot you all in the face.
Can I also say there was the furlough scheme analysis by IPPR earlier this week, and they estimate that 45% of all that money from the furlough scheme, which is now going to be north of 50 billion. Before it was 30 to 40, now it's going to be 50 billion, given it's running into August. 45% of that is going to rentiers, whether it's interest on loans, whether it's interest on mortgages, or whether it's rents from people having to rent houses and flats. So already you have a scheme where 45% of this big intervention to help working class people, 45% is actually going to rentiers. And so you don't need a policy to help rentiers. Already every single you have to really work hard to not have a policy that actually goes to rentiers because of the base of how the UK economy works. And yet she was saying, well, look, some people who rent won't need the money. I'm sure that's true. There'll be some people who rent who have a bit of money in the bank, sure. But we have quite a big divide in this country between asset owners and renters. It really wouldn't hurt to even give, some of the renters who might have £2,000 or £3,000 in the bank, heaven forbid, they might have an extra 1,000 or 2,000 in the bank as well. If you were looking for a big transfer of resources to mitigate the beginnings of this crisis, I can't think of anything better, in fact. And then finally, on the point of universalism, we've known for 20 years, actually universal policy, countries with universal welfarist policies have lower rates of inequality, and they had the highest levels of political buy-in from the middle class. I think the paper is Corby and Palme. I wrote a piece for the LRB 3 years ago about...
Look at that memory, citing the paper. Preach, preacher.
LRB 3 years ago on school dinners when Labour announced the policy and everybody said, the whole lobby, the Westminster sort of establishment said, this is ridiculous. Guess what? It polled really, really well. People think that kids, regardless of where they come from, should be fed well at school. Who knew? Universalist policy, very popular. And I talked about this paper. We've known this for 20 years. And yet you've still got people like Thangham Debbonaire in 2020, not 1999, 2020 are still living this kind of Clintonite, New Democrat, New Labour politics. Oh, well, means testing has to be everything. Universalism's bad. It's not progressive. We've known this is factually inaccurate for 2 decades, not 6 months, 2 decades. When are these people going to get the message? This is not an ideological political point. This is an empirical fact established by social science.
We're going to end this segment with the wise words of an American radical who understands the evils of landlordism and is thoroughly opposed to this shift to the right that the Labour Party have currently done. No, it's not Bernie Sanders. It's not Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It's not Noam Chomsky. It's Joe Biden. Okay, so Joe Biden, in an interview with Good Luck America on Wednesday, said the following. There should be rent forgiveness and there should be mortgage forgiveness now in the middle of this crisis. Forgiveness, not paid later, forgiveness. It's critically important to people who are in the lower income strata. Joe Biden. Joe Biden, who thinks that universal healthcare is too radical. He is now to the left of Keir Starmer and Thangham Debbonaire when it comes to rental policy in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic. Like, what the hell is going on here? Come on.
But he wants to get elected.
Joe Biden, who would be in the Conservative Party in this country.
He wants to get elected. He wants to win, right? He obviously wants to win. Whereas Thangham Debbonaire, this policy, but we all agree. I'm sure many of our viewers agree. I hope we've articulated the facts. It doesn't make sense as a policy. It's socially unjust. Forget all of that. Like Ash says, the number one demographic likely to vote for Labour are renters, and this is the equivalent of shooting them in the face. Why? It's almost like they just have this death wish.
We're going to go to a couple of comments before going to our next section. Titchard Rice, over £20 super chat, says, are we done pretending these clowns are worth supporting yet? Unless we want to be stuck doing lesser evilism next GE, they need to be replaced. I mean, we've all talked on this show about how having another party to the left of Labour just doesn't really work because of our electoral system, but obviously a legitimate opinion. Jane Hayward with a £10 super chat says, great discussion. Thangham Debbonaire is my MP. Well, maybe have a word with her. Send her a letter saying that, send her the NEF document with a much better policy for people in rent arrears over coronavirus. That would be a very helpful thing to do. I think MPs have to pay more attention to what their constituents send them. Obviously, share the show link. We want to get more people watching this show. Tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour. Next story. Back in March, when the country was about to go into lockdown, the government identified a problem. You can't self-isolate in your home if you don't have a house. So in response, they announced a £3.2 million scheme named Everybody In to provide the homeless with rooms in hotels and hostels. As a result, the government effectively ended homelessness overnight. However, with the easing of the lockdown, this is now already coming to an end. Once again, what the government is selling as a liberation from lockdown could in fact be better described as a stripping away of our rights to protect ourselves from this terrible disease. So this is the Manchester Evening News. So they reported on the basis of a leaked government document. We're going to get that up now. So civil servants have told Greater Manchester official that the scheme known as Everyone In is no longer being funded by central government and that March's original COVID guidance to local authorities has been scrapped. So the article says that 1,600 homeless people have so far been provided with emergency accommodation in Manchester. That's including hotels. And ministers haven't officially announced an end to this scheme. It's just something which has been told, behind the scenes privately to councils. And I mean, the thing about this that I just find completely striking, right, is one, obviously, we believe in a society where street homelessness should not exist. We believe in a society where no kind of homeless would exist, where no one has to live in insecure housing. But even in, the awful neoliberal capitalist society that we currently live in, this scheme cost £3.2 million. What this showed is you can end street homelessness in this country with £3.2 million. Like, how penny pinching do you have to be to, in the middle of a global pandemic? The pandemic isn't over. If you're watching the government press conference today, R is very close to 1 now. It could even be 1. So we have no way suppressed this virus, and the government that £3.2 million, we can save that now. Let's kick the homeless people back onto the streets. It's not like the hotels hotels aren't doing good business at the moment.
Are the tourists flooding back? Like, is everyone like, ooh, okay, I'd really like to go see the Tower of London and stay overnight, but actually there's a homeless person in the hotel room that I would otherwise book? Is something else going to be done with the space? No. It's cruelty, and the reason why it's cruel is because it's ideological, right? It was cheap to do. It was straightforward to execute. It also helped prop up an industry which would particularly struggle during this time, the hospitality and hotelier industry. And the reason why you have to end it is because you can't decommodify housing, can you? You can't say it's a human right. It's relatively easy to give someone a roof over their heads, to take them out of unsheltered homelessness, put them into temporary accommodation and then start looking for, a fixed abode to roll into that, in a supported way. If you admit how easy it is, people start asking questions about why the previous decade has seen such huge spikes in rough sleeping, such awful conditions for rough sleepers, and asking why haven't you fixed it before if it was so easy? Better to do it now when people are distracted with other things, and then when people are out in central London, central Manchester, central Liverpool again, well, you see the same number of homeless people as you ever did, so it's not going to be a huge shock. But it's disgusting and it's cruel and it's done for ideological purposes, not pragmatic ones.
I would add one more thing. The worst possible case scenario for the Tories in this whole thing, because it's effectively a mass pilot, is it works. That's the worst case scenario. What if we spend this money, use these resources, like Ash says, for a very straightforward, universal solution? If you're homeless, we will house you. What if these people turn their lives around? What if when you actually do give something for nothing, people respond positively? It undermines the core principles of conservatism, in particular since Margaret Thatcher over the last 40 years. And so Ash is absolutely right. This is being dismissed, gotten rid of, not because it's ineffective, not because it's expensive, but because it just might work.
It's the government saying, "Don't get used to this. We know it might be nice to not sleep on a cold hard pavement, but don't raise your expectations. Heaven forbid." Okay, please like the video and subscribe to this video. I really want us to get over 100k subscribers by the end of the summer, at least by the end of the year. So hit that subscribe button if you have not already. We're going to our next story. Boris Johnson's announcement on Sunday about an easing of the lockdown has been unraveling ever since. Many of the changes announced were made in haste with little consultation with those people who they would directly affect. One of those affected groups is the teaching profession and obviously also parents. So Boris Johnson announced schools should aim to reopen for some year groups on the 1st of June at the earliest, but that's what they're supposed to be aiming for. The teaching unions have opposed the move. They've set 5 tests, which they say must be met before they'll agree to go back to work. They include regular tests for staff and pupils. The overall infections in the country are lower than they currently are. And that a proper social distancing plan is in place. They're also thoroughly pissed off that this announcement was made without any consultation with them. There are so many people who found out something new about their industry, which they hadn't been told about on that ridiculous speech to the country at 7 p.m. last Sunday. But in any case, Education Secretary Gavin Williamson has since accused the National Education Union and actually all the education trade unions of scaremongering. So the government are going to war now with the education unions. And the Daily Mail this morning came out with this highly inflammatory front page. So the headline: magnificent staff across the nation are desperate to help millions of children get back to the classroom, but militant unions are standing in their way. To them, the Mail implores, let our teachers be heroes. We can get up a bit of the comment as well. This is Daily Mail comment. Very important opinion about how our country should work. The great constellation of this COVID crisis has been Britain's bonding together in a spirit of compassion and generosity. So what a crashing disappointment that the teaching unions refuse to join the common cause instead playing petty politics. They are obviously happy to gamble with children's futures, but the Mail firmly believes most teachers are better than that. The profession's silent majority know where their duty lies. We urge them to find their voice. So to discuss this story, I'm delighted to be joined by James McCash, a Labour councillor in Lambeth and a primary school teacher. How are you doing, James?
Yeah, I'm okay, thanks. Getting by.
Are you disappointed that the union has stood in the way of you becoming a national hero on the front line of our education system?
I am disappointed. I feel I've always felt I would suit a cape, so that's a real letdown for me. But no, I mean the trade unions, the National Education Union, the other trade unions are standing up for our rights. They're standing up for the rights of children to stay safe, and frankly, we're doing absolutely the right thing.
And what are, in sort of practical terms, what is your job like at the moment? Are you still doing, educational stuff online, or can you talk to me about how the experience of being a teacher in lockdown is at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think there's sort of myth going around that we teachers are doing literally nothing at the moment, and that couldn't be further from the truth. So it varies by different schools. And what I'm doing in my school is we are preparing daily work for the children to do. So a little bit of maths, a little bit of English. We've got an ongoing project for them to be getting on with, where they're I teach year 3, and they're working on producing a little book, sort of a sketchbook and a notebook about birds. So they're doing some research about birds. And then there's a whole school project on growing tomatoes. And that's something obviously the whole family can get involved in. And the school's been providing those families with those tomato plants. So it's quite an engaging curriculum. At the same time, obviously some students are going into school. Schools, we've been talking about schools reopening, but of course schools have been open the entire time. In fact, schools have been open over the holidays as well. It's just very small numbers of children going in, the children who are most vulnerable, the children who are whose parents are key workers. But they're going in, and that of course means that teachers are going in as well to teach them and to look after them. And then finally, there's a welfare element that's happening as well. So me and my colleagues have been splitting up the list of children and parents, and we've been ringing up their homes to check that they've got hold of the free school meal vouchers that they should have been given, to check that they're able to access the online learning we're providing, to ask if they need anything sent to their houses, and just generally to see if they're okay. So we're keeping very busy with all the work we're doing in the schools. Then of course there's the union work, which I'm sure we're going to get onto in a moment.
So what is it? Yeah, I suppose. So in terms of the NEU, but also you as a professional, what is it that you would like to see in place that would make you confident about going back to work and having a full classroom or a semi-full classroom? Is it just the idea that June is way too early, let's wait till September, or is it that the government haven't put in place sufficient preparations or guidance or capacities, for example, to test people? What could the government do that would make you feel comfortable and secure going back to school, say before the summer holiday, say before August?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess I'm a teacher. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a virologist. I'm not an epidemiologist. So I'm going to have to base what I'm doing on the evidence that's around and who's advocating for different positions. At the moment, the people who are saying that it is safe to go back to schools on June the 1st are our right-wing Tory government, the Daily Mail, and the angry people on Twitter. Whereas the people saying that it's not safe to go back to school at the moment is my trades union, the National Education Union, the other major teaching union, the NASUWT, the head teachers trade union, the NAHT, and now the organisation that represents the medical profession, the BMA. So I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, I'm not able to make the decision for myself, but I certainly know who I'm going to trust on that one.
There was one element of this, obviously, I mean, at Novara Media, we're very sympathetic to this idea that you trust the BMA and the NEU over Boris Johnson's government. But there was one thing I thought was potentially a bit of an own goal, which was the NEU using this phrase that they're advising teachers not to engage in planning to prepare to go back to school, because that's meant that's what's plastered on the headlines all weeks. And it can make it seem a bit like obstructionism, don't even engage with it. I don't know if you feel like there was some context missed in sort of how that was reported, or if that was a bit of a mistake.
I mean, the fact is that the government is asking schools to prepare to go back for a plan that just doesn't add up. There is no PPE, there is inadequate testing. The government have themselves admitted that it is simply impossible to have social distancing in a primary school. I don't know if you know many 5-year-olds, but you can't just tell them to stay 2 meters away from each other. It just doesn't work. I mean, the government's plans are outrageous. They've said that if a child seems to have symptoms, then do you know what you should do with them, Michael? You should put them in a room on their own and close the door. That's what you're supposed to do. And let's not forget that you mentioned at the beginning that a number of year groups have been chosen to go back. It's the youngest children who've been chosen to go back. You put a 5-year-old in a room on their own, tell them that no one can come in until they're picked up to go home. What are they going to think? It's going to be a traumatic experience for them. So we have been engaging. The national unions have been engaging. There's been regular meetings with the government, with the cabinet. The conversations have been ongoing about how to make it safe for schools to return. When the announcement came out, there had been discussions about year 6 returning, which is one of those 3 year groups. But the 5 and 6 year olds in reception and year 1, that had never been discussed. That came out absolutely out of nowhere. And the reason it came out of nowhere is because it is nothing to do with children's welfare. Okay, there's maybe a case for saying that we should be trying to get year 6s back relatively soon. Year 6 is, of course, the oldest age in primary school, and they're about to make that transition to secondary school. Maybe they need a bit of preparation for that, to support with that quite big transition. What is the reason why you would have a load of 5-year-olds running around a school? Like, it's just like, it's not possible to maintain social distancing for them, and it is really, really damaging. Even trying to get a 5-year-old to social distance, I think, could be really damaging for their emotional and their social development. Tell them they can't like hug their friends, can't play games with their pals. There was that horrible photo that was going around on Twitter yesterday of a school in France where they'd drawn chalk squares in the playground. The children were allowed to run around in their own little sort of chalk prison when they're supposed to be having their play. It's just absolutely not right. The government's plan is back to front. You know, if you think you're going to do something that's risky, say you think you're going to go skydiving soon, okay, the first thing you do is you make sure you've got a parachute. You don't say, I'm going skydiving tomorrow, doesn't matter, I'll try and get the parachute if I can. If I can't, never mind, I've set the date. That's not what you do. You do it the other way around. You make sure things are safe and then you do it. You don't set a date first.
I'm going to bring Ashin in one moment for a question. Final question from me is sort of what happens next if the unions and the teachers are saying we're not going back, the government say schools are opening on the 1st of June. You know, what happens in this weird standoff? Like, how does it work? Could the teachers actually go on strike, or is it just a case of if people don't comply, then the policy doesn't happen? I mean, what will happen on the 1st of June?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and we are in uncharted territory, absolutely. I mean, as you know, the government, successive governments have made it very, very difficult to go on strike. So it simply wouldn't be possible for the NEU to take industrial action, to take strike action for June the 1st. I'm not saying, when I say it's not possible, I'm not saying, you know, it's too hard to win the ballot or anything like that. It simply isn't possible with the timeframes there. It's just, it would be against the law to do that. So there won't be any strike action for June the 1st. Instead, we're relying on that Section 44 guidance, which is to advise our members that if you do not think it is safe to go into work, then do not go into work and contact us about it. I think the important thing to remember here, though, is that, you know, in that normal kind of industrial relationship, the employer and the employee are diametrically opposed. In this situation, it's a little bit more complicated because of the nature of how schools work. Head teachers are not going to reopen. They're not sort of looking at their profit margins thinking, God, we need to get those 5-year-olds back in quick. That's not happening at all. A lot of head teachers really don't want to open either. And if they have their teaching staff coming to them saying, look, we're not prepared to come in on that basis, I think a lot of head teachers are going to be quite relieved.
Ash, I know you want to come in.
Okay, I mean, one of the things that you were saying about the guidance for symptomatic children to isolate them in a room all day by themselves, the door closed, is just horrific. And it reminded me of a story that my mum told me. She used to be a primary school teacher before I was born, and I think when my sister was very, very little. And it was around the time of the HIV crisis, and teachers were being instructed, and there was all this scaremongering in the right wing press that you shouldn't touch a child who was HIV positive because of vertical transmission. And so it meant that in the school where she worked, that, you know, there was a little boy who didn't understand why teachers didn't want to touch him, and he'd fall over in the playground and he was sort of shunned. And my mom was like the only teacher to like pick him up, give him a cuddle, and put a plaster on his knee and stuff like that. And it's just sort of the casual cruelty of this policy, which is made without thinking that children are capable of emotional pain and feelings, is just horrible. But James, I've got a really stupid question for you. I have the stupidest question, and after Michael asked you really smart ones, I feel really bad. But can I ask you the stupid question?
Please do.
What is a Zoom call with loads of primary school children like? Because I would pay money to see it.
I'm sorry, I can't actually answer that. We're not doing Zoom calls. We're organising work for the children to do, but it takes the form in a tweet with a link to a page with an example of some work and some things that they can then be getting on with. We've not been doing Zoom calls with 30 primary school children. I've heard it has happened in a few places, but frankly, it sounds chaotic. It's difficult enough controlling 30 children when they're in front of you.
Can you do one mass Zoom call for the bants? Like maybe when we're coming out of lockdown and things are better, just one mass Zoom call. Like with the most chaotic age children, just see what happens.
Okay, we'll give it a go. And if we can't find the children willing to volunteer, perhaps we can have Novara media presenters role-playing the children.
It would be less chaotic with the actual children, I can assure you.
We're going to have to let you go, but first of all, Valen Shepherd says, this teacher is great, have him back. So we want to know how this story develops. But James McCash, thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening.
Thank you.
Good. Teachers are always really articulate. Actually, whenever we have a teacher on the show, I'm like, these people are really good speakers because they speak to 30 kids for 8 hours a day. Before we go on to the next story, I do just want to get up this letter from the BMA because I do think this has really basically ended the argument. I think there was a attempt by the Daily Mail, by Gavin Williamson, to play divide and rule between teachers and doctors. But I think, this letter from the British Medical Association, that's over now. So let's just get up that now, and I'll read out some of it. So the BMA has, so this is second half of the first paragraph. The BMA has noted the launch of your campaign and the publication of your 5 tests, and we stand in full support of you. The BMA's Public Health Medicine Committee has considered the evidence available on reopening schools and has found it to be thus far conflicting, which is perhaps unsurprising given the relatively small amount of research available on the uncharted territory we find ourselves in. A paper from New South Wales found very little transmission associated with schools and suggested that children were very much less susceptible to serious illness, but were more likely to have asymptomatic infection. Conversely, a more recent paper from Berlin looking at viral loads in children suggests they are just as likely to be infected as adults and maybe just as infectious. We therefore need to know more about the infectivity of children. In light of these studies, however, the view of the members of the PHMH is completely aligned with the NEU, the National Education Union, until we have got case numbers much lower. We should not consider reopening schools. The NEU is absolutely right to urge caution, to prioritise testing and to protect the vulnerable. We cannot risk a second spike or take actions which would increase the spread of this virus, particularly as we see sustained rates of infection across the UK. In response to the government's announcement this week on easing lockdown restrictions, I said that I believe their plan was too fast, too confusing, and too risky. They would do well to heed your 5 tests before taking any further premature action. So take that, Gavin Williamson. When you say that the teachers are scaremongering because they don't want to go back to work, maybe talk to the people who actually know their shit. The doctors are saying the teachers are absolutely right. You're going too fast, too far, and without any kind of plan. Nonsense. And I think the teachers are going to win this one. Right. We're going to go to our next story. First of all, this show is only possible because of your kind support. If you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. If not, please go to novaramedia.com/support. And I understand we're getting a lot of super chats tonight. So thank you for those. Very helpful. Make us feel great. But also, if you are someone who doesn't click the super chat but donates and subscribes on the website, we also love you. Right. Next story. Boris Johnson's rushed announcement on Sunday has meant a de facto end of the lockdown. Trains are already busy at rush hour as those who can't work from home are pressured into work. The debate about the easing of lockdown so far has been framed as one about timing. Is the lockdown ending too early or too late? But this kind of misses the point. The issue isn't what date we leave lockdown, but whether or not the government have the infrastructure in place to ensure that the easing of a lockdown doesn't lead to a second peak. And what does that mean? It means we need an up and running test and trace system, and we do not have one. So we know the NHS contact tracing app is still in its trial phase on the Isle of Wight, but we were also promised an army of contact tracers to help track the contacts of people who have tested positive. There's no point in knowing someone's positive. You don't know who they've been in touch with. So Matt Hancock had promised 18,000 contact tracers would be hired by mid-May. We're in mid-May. But today we learned the process, like so many government policies, is behind schedule. So Brandon Lewis was asked this morning whether that 8,000 target has been met.
I don't think we've got to 18,000 just yet. I think there's about 15,000 applications. We're looking to, as you say, get up to 18,000.
And that's applications, you say, not actually people that have been hired?
Yes, and and it's fantastic that people have applied for that, and we would encourage more people to think about applying for that, because that's a very, very direct way in which people can play a hugely important part in how we deal with this virus, particularly as we come out of exit and with a view to making sure that we stay on the other side of this virus.
OK, so when do you aim to reach that target that was due to be the middle of May, which we are at now, of 18,000 people actually hired?
Well, as I say, we're encouraging people to apply for that. We've got 15,000 applications at the moment. I know the health team are working through those applications as quickly as possible.
So working through them, sorry, I know we are getting short on time, but I just want to establish these figures. They are important. How many people of those 15,000 applications have currently been hired?
As of this morning, I'm not sure exactly how many of the 15,000 have been hired. And earlier in the week, it was about 1,500. It would have gone up since then.
So the whole point of a lockdown is, one, yeah, you get the R rate down, but then you build up capacity. That means when you reopen, you can suppress the virus. So it would be fine, actually, if we had busy people at rush hour going to work, if we had an up and running system where people could get tested, get their results very quickly, and then if they were positive, we could isolate them and tell everyone they've been in touch with. Then we should all be comfortable with people being on the buses. It doesn't matter what month it is. That could have happened already. If we had a contact tracing system, then the lockdown wouldn't have been eased too early. The reason it's been eased too early is because the government have wasted 8 weeks without building any of this infrastructure whatsoever. We were promised 18,000, an army of contact tracers. How many? 1,500 have been recruited. And you might also think, only 15,000 have applied. Why have so few people applied for this incredibly important job when unemployment is skyrocketing? What's wrong with the British public? Now, I mean, maybe it hasn't been well advertised, I don't know, but something that I thought was interesting is how much this is paid. So it's quite a difficult job, I think. You have to call people up potentially and tell them that they might have coronavirus. £8.72 an hour you get for this job. So that is how seriously this government is taking this army of contact tracers. And the one key to getting us out of a lockdown safely, which is testing and contact tracing, they're paying the people doing this incredibly important job that lets our country get up and running after, a lockdown which has crashed the economy. £8.72 an hour. I mean, and we should not be easing the lockdown until these systems are in place. I'm going to go to you two in a moment, but first of all, I just want to point out, that not every government is like this. So I think the lack of ambition that our government shows is kind of exceptional. Not only do they promise things they can't deliver, but they just, there's really basic stuff that they haven't even thought of, it seems. I want to go to a story about Denmark. So their track and trace system, which is already looks like it's going to be sort of up and running, but also it's just going to be loads better than ours, according to the plan. So let's get up this graphic. This is from The Local, which is a great source of news, and from European countries, all published in English. So can we get this up? The government will set up a new phone hotline to help those who have been diagnosed as having the virus. List all the people they have been in contact with, which will primarily include those they live with, family members, friends, and work colleagues. These close contacts will then be tested on the 4th and 6th day after they were in contact with the infected person. The government has asked municipalities to hire rooms in hotels, hostels, and holiday villages and offer them to those asked to go into quarantine so that those that they live with can continue to move freely in society. Now, there are two elements of this. So in terms of the calling up people and finding the contact tracers, that's the contact tracing our army that we should already have, but we've only got 1,500 out of what was it supposed to be? 18,000 for some bizarre reason. I'm sure that what we're paying them isn't even the minimum wage in Denmark. But the bits that are really impressive here is you get tested on the 4th and the 6th day after you're in contact, with them, because on the 4th you might still get a false negative, so because you don't have a big enough viral load yet. So they're being really careful there. And the bit that I thought was amazing is that they are going to do what is the best way to suppress this virus, which is what they did in China, which is individual quarantine. So instead of saying, if you're positive, go back and give it to your family and then lock up your family altogether for 2 weeks, they say, if you're positive, you can go stay in a hotel room. And that means that, when you're isolated, no one catches it. It's not that your family catches it and then you will stay there. And I mean, the argument that's been made against this is it's a bit authoritarian, but you don't have to force people to do it. Most people, if you say you can go back to your family and give them coronavirus, or you can stay in this hotel room that we've booked you for 2 weeks. They're going to go to the hotel room for 2 weeks. So, I mean, this is great. There's no reason why we could not do this here. It's not like Denmark has hotel rooms and we don't. It's that Denmark has ambition and we don't. Aaron, I know that, or Ash is popping up. Although I'm going to go to Aaron first just because he loved talking about the lack of ambition of the British state. So, he's muted.
There's a deep irony here, or maybe it's a paradox, which is that because they are so emphatically desperate to get the economy going again, whether it's the US or the UK, the very steps they're taking will depress economic output more than anywhere else. So what Denmark is doing is going to cost loads of money. It's going to require loads of state intervention, but it's ultimately going to cost much, much less than what we're going to see in the UK, where the R number goes above 1. I think that seems almost inevitable already, where we see a peak possibly higher than we've already had, where we see an economic and a political crisis if this becomes unmanageable, where we see the composite nations of the United Kingdom all doing different things. You're creating a bit of a constitutional crisis there. Surely it would have just made sense that, like you say, Michael, give these people 15, 20 quid an hour. What's the problem? You're going to get huge numbers of applicants. You're going to get people who want to do a very tough job. And yeah, prop up the hotel industry, because like Ash says, whether it's with this or with housing people who are street homeless, that's an industry which is going to be really suffering. You're actually also helping them as well. But it just boils down to a fanatical hatred and inability to believe that the state can do anything, that it can solve any problems. And ultimately, that's actually going to hurt business more than any other strategy. Actually, it turns out if you trust the state, like the Danes, like the Chinese, that's better for the private sector. And I think that's going to be something that the market fundamentalists and the right-wing libertarians in this country and the United States are going to find out the hard way.
I just want to get up one little example of what, simple things, silly things that our government can't do that others can. So in France, they've made masks mandatory on public transport and in schools, and they're just handing them out to the public. So I think we can get some footage up now of a French tube station where people are being handed them. They're already wearing them, but they're saying, probably need another one for tomorrow. And how many times have we heard our government say, "Oh, we can't give you masks or PPE because there's a global shortage"? Well, I mean, if there's a global shortage, why can France have masks but we can't? I mean, I know that they've doubled production actually during this period, because probably they have a manufacturing base, and also they have some state capacity so that they can actually do things when they say it, instead of just asking on Twitter if anyone can happen to make some masks. But what that means is when they're reopening public transport, it's less likely to be a super spreader event every time anyone gets on the Central line. I mean, why can't we do that? Ash, do you want to come in, or should we go to Nadine Dorries and fake news?
No, I mean, I do want to come in on this, because this week, with the return to work for mostly blue-collar workers, I've been looking into some of the cases of security guards and cleaners who have died during the pandemic so far. So that means that they contracted the virus at the most restrictive part of the lockdown, and that's when they died. One such man was Emmanuel Gomez. Emmanuel Gomez worked as a cleaner at the Ministry of Justice. The offices were mostly empty because obviously most of the MOJ staff had gone home, were working from home. But because the company OCS, who ran the outsourced cleaners, didn't want to lose the contract, they kept in sending staff. So Emmanuel Gomez was part of the day shift, which meant that he had to get on packed public transport. So just think about that for a second. The government hadn't made any kind of alternative arrangements for essential staff who are still going in central London. You had to pack on to a reduced train service, no masks. Goes in to clean a near empty office, right? So it's scarcely operational. He is only eligible for the £95 a week statutory sick pay, because that hasn't gone up during this crisis. Which means that he's so scared of losing income that when he starts to lose his appetite and develop a fever, he keeps going in to work. He was eventually taken back home by a colleague when he was on the verge of physical collapse, and he was delirious, and he died on April the 24th. Now, this is just one man's story, and this is just one person whose name we know because of the phenomenal work done by his union, United Voices of the World, from this Monday, because the government fucked up its own communications. We've seen images of packed tubes at Canning Town, packed buses in Newham, hardly any face masks among them, people going back to work, and people going back to work before the complete clownery of that safety guidance was published on Monday afternoon. Between that time, Monday and Wednesday, you've had conflicting bits of advice coming out from the government about how many people you can see and socialise with. But you've also had the national testing programme lose thousands of test results. So that much vaunted 100,000 dispatched tests from a couple of weeks ago is now completely in the toilet. As Michael said, contact tracing is still not set up. We still don't have clear guidance on the statutory obligation of employers to provide PPE or what kind of precautions people should be taking on public transport. Grant Shapps tells us that it's our civic duty to avoid public transport. Now, people aren't on tubes and buses because they're going to the theatre. They're not going to the pub. They're going into work just like you told them. And selfish British public, they've yet to develop the ability to teleport. So looking at those scenes this week, how many Emmanuel Gomez's are there going to be in 2 weeks, 3 weeks? He's left behind a wife and a daughter who are having to crowdfund on, I think it's Just Giving, to repatriate his body, right? So they can bury him and give him a decent funeral. How many other wives and daughters are there going to be in a few weeks' time? And it's all because this government can't get its act together.
That is so true. That's such an important point. And it's not also, I mean, because it's not just incompetence, because fine, you can't get your act together. It's not particularly impressive, but, maybe you're just not up to the job. But if you can't get your act together, then what should you do? Stay in lockdown longer. Yeah. So if it's taking you a while to get the test and trace system up and running, if it's taking you a while to get adequate PPE provided, that's, I'd like it to be quicker. I'd like you to be better at it. But it only becomes immoral, I think, actually, when they say, "Oh, well, we can't do it, but we're going to open up anyway because it's, we've got these donors, these funders, and these right-wing newspapers that are telling us we have to do this." And also, people are getting a bit comfortable with state support, and we feel like that might undermine our vision of society. So fuck it. Even if we can't do the test and trace thing, let's just send people back out to work, and it probably won't be people we know who catch COVID-19 on the tube. I'm going to go to a couple of comments. Super chats before we go on to our final story. Both lovely ones, actually. Lauren Hennessy with a £20 super chat. So much gratitude from an absolutely exhausted teacher and NEU rep in Bristol. We are working flat out to ensure a safe return for all. Lols. And I met Makash when we were teenagers. Great to see him on here. And Camel McClelland, £15 super chat. Thank you for keeping me sane, Novara. Here's an hour's wage from a junior doctor working on a COVID ward. Much love. We love our public sector workers, both heroes. Thank you so much for that. We really appreciate it. As ever, tweet the show, share the link, tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour. Okay, this is our final story for the evening. It's kind of, you could call it lighter, or I suppose there's dark elements of it, but it's people being ridiculous. So 3 Conservative MPs have shared a video which purported to show that Labour leader Keir Starmer had been dismissive of the victims of child sexual exploitation when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. So the MPs in question were Lucy Allen. So she's quote tweeting this tweet from N. James World. We'll look at the original tweet in a moment. She says, "This suggests a total failure to understand grooming, a dismissive attitude toward child sexual exploitation victims, and a belief that the victims brought it on themselves." So quote tweeting the same tweet, Maria Caulfield MP wrote, "The true face of Labour leader, hashtag shameful." And Nadine Dorries, who was a shadow health minister, quote tweeted the video saying, "Revealing." Now, at least those first 2 tweets, it seems like this is something very serious. Obviously, if he had been dismissive of victims of child sexual exploitation, that would be, appalling. Let's look at the tweet they were sharing. So this is the video that all 3 of these Tory MPs shared.
Were made included the assumption that a victim of child sexual abuse will swiftly report what's happened to them to the police, will be able to give a coherent and consistent account first time, that they will not themselves have engaged in any offending or other behaviour, and that they will not have misused drugs or alcohol at any stage.
So that video is presented as saying, this is why, or this is how Keir Starmer approached child sexual exploitation. So it's saying Keir Starmer would only accept a witness to child sexual abuse if they had swiftly reported the abuse, had given a consistent account from the first report, had not themselves broken the law or used drugs and alcohol. Now, that would be pretty shocking. And also, that is how the state has functioned. And it is incredibly shocking. But that video of Keir Starmer is completely misleading. And also, obviously so. I don't think the MPs really can claim ignorance in this moment. But let's look at the full clip now.
Just how much of an acknowledgement is this that the methods you've been using up until now, albeit everyone's been working very hard, but the methods you've been using up until now just have been really in the wrong mindset and so misguided?
These guidelines are a recognition that the approach that's been taken in the past was the wrong approach. It was based on a number of assumptions which don't withstand scrutiny. The guidelines change that, and they require the police and prosecutors to focus intensely on the allegation actually being made, and not so much on the weaknesses or vulnerabilities that are invariably there in some of the victims that come forward.
Could you just expand a little on what you mean by the kind of things that were going wrong? Just give us some kind of obvious examples of how the previous guidelines weren't really up to standard.
The assumptions that were made included the assumption that a victim of child sexual abuse will swiftly report what's happened to them to the police, will be able to give a coherent and consistent account first time, that they will not themselves have engaged in any offending or other behaviour, and that they will not have misused drugs or alcohol at any stage. Those assumptions do not withstand scrutiny. They've got to change. The guidelines make that clear, and so this is a clear break with the past.
So, I mean, it couldn't be clearer. Keir Starmer was saying, this is how it used to work, and this is precisely why we're changing our guidelines. And what these Tory MPs have shared is the bit where he says, this is how it used to work. And they're saying that's his justification for how he was operating in the CPS. So it's a complete reversal of what actually happened. And I mean, this Nadine Dorries, at least, she's a government minister. She's a health minister. She should have very important things to do at the moment without sharing nonsense fake news about the leader of the opposition.
Well, she should, but would you trust Nadine Dorries with very important things to do?
That's true. God, that's terrifying, isn't it, actually, that she is a health minister? I often think of her just as a sort of joke character, but that she does have a position of responsibility is absolutely terrifying.
So, I mean, I quite recently had a clip go viral around far-right Twitter around the Yes Lads We're Winning, right? Where it was clipped out of context. And in the context, it would show you that I'm taking the piss out of the very view which is then being assigned to me when it's taken out of that context and sent around. Now, the reason why it's able to go so far is because it's being propped up by an existing ecosystem of hatred, bigotry, and far-right ideology. Anyone with the, faintest semblance of media literacy would have even looked at that clip and gone, well, she's clearly being facetious. Right? So she can't be seen to genuinely mean what she's saying because of her delivery. Now, if you look at Keir Starmer's, even the edited clip, it's very clear that he's saying these were the assumptions being made. So you have to be really willing somebody to embody the worst characteristics that you have already assigned to them in order for you to make that mistake. So it's not something which is born simply of ignorance. It's really building on something that's already there. And that's how these clips go viral. And what's worrying is that what had once been, a at sometimes flimsy and other times robust firewall between the establishment parliamentary right and the extreme far right has completely been decimated, in part because of Brexit, but also because of, Boris Johnson's willingness to shift his party in that direction, speak to that cohort of Britain and at best turn a blind eye and at worst encourage those views amongst his own MPs. And so you've got, sort of clusters of MPs who've kind of always been flirting with a very strange kind of, white nationalist conspiratorial resentment, who are ideal candidates to platform and signal boost this kind of, falsified conspiracy theory regarding Keir Starmer. Now, what's really good is that Keir Starmer has enough pull with the media at this moment in time to be able to have those who are sympathetic towards him rebut this view. It's deleted by Nadine Dorries and so on and so forth, that no apology has been forthcoming yet, and it hasn't damaged him at the level of mainstream media just yet. But we're still very early into his leadership. And if we've got senior Conservatives playing this dirty now, when we're still 4 years out officially from an election, and you've also got that kind of, WhatsApp fascist ecology of conspiracy theories and rumors already having a decent amount of traction, both on the internet and making their way onto the Conservative, government benches, that's worrying.
Just going to go to a couple of past tweets from Nadine Dorries, because she does have
form.
I mean, she has form. Sorry, that's the phrase, isn't it? In terms of tweeting far-right accounts and being basically awful online. So let's get up this first one. I think it's from 2018, is it? Can we get out this tweet? So she says, "Ministers, are you having a laugh?" And what she's doing is quoting there another far-right account. So this one of Keir Starmer was also a far-right account, saying Muslims can receive benefits for multiple wives. Yes, that's from the 17th of September 2018. Obviously, that's a Tommy Robinson supporting account. Anyone who's not a complete idiot can recognize that. So either she is a complete idiot and she shouldn't have a position of responsibility in the British government, or she is actively sharing far-right material.
What about both?
Potentially both. Yeah, I think those two do often go together, actually, don't they? There's a strong theory there, Ash. And our next tweet, our next piece of evidence. So here she is quote tweeting a video from Sadiq Khan back in 2018. So his, I think, video is about hate speech. And she says, "How about it's time to act on sex abusing grooming gangs instead? Hashtag Telford grooming, hashtag Rotherham, hashtag priorities, hashtag leadership." Now, Sadiq Khan is mayor of London. He's from London. We know his dad was a bus driver. So what does he have with Telford grooming or the appalling grooming that was going on in Rotherham? What possible reason could she be quote tweeting Sadiq Khan to say that, other than that he is a high profile Muslim politician? No other explanation. That tweet hasn't even been deleted, by the way. So this is a health minister currently in government who has quite obviously abused the most high-profile Muslim politician in the country, and that's seen as completely acceptable. Appalling. The political response to these tweets, there's also an issue here. I thought, in terms of when this was first shared, this could be a good opportunity for Keir Starmer to clear the air, because we know that these videos are going to be going viral during this period, especially on WhatsApp groups, potentially a bit underground. People will see that clip, and without any context, they might think, "Oh, that is pretty bad. Maybe Keir Starmer doesn't care about grooming. Maybe he's someone who really dismisses girls who've been sexually abused." And I thought, because it's been he can maybe take Nadine Dorries to court. He can get her to apologize publicly, get a bit of profile on it, and so that will mean that it will have been a story that is publicly debunked. But he didn't go for that. I suppose I'll ask you, Aaron, if you think that was a missed opportunity on his part. So let's get up this graphic, which was what the Downing Street spokesman said. So this was the response to Nadine Dorries from the Conservative Party. "These tweets have rightly been deleted. The MPs involved have been spoken to by the Whip's office and reminded of their responsibility to check the validity of information before they post on social media sites." Now, that could not be a weaker reprimand. Check the validity of information before they post on social media. Now, that's like that. That seems like they've posted that. Oh, sorry, I'm a constituency MP, and the local newsagent there's been an accident there. Blah, 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 blah. Not sharing some far right video, which is obviously doctored, which is smearing the leader of the opposition in the middle of a national crisis. That's ridiculous. But then this is Labour's response. This is also from that BBC article. So Keir said he was satisfied with the actions taken by the party and the MPs who have deleted the tweets. "They're a more important thing in the world to concentrate on than a doctored video of me," he added. Now, I mean, from my perspective, obviously there are more important things in the world to concentrate on than a doctored video of Keir Starmer. But also, I mean, there are plenty of libel lawyers in the world who aren't currently working on coronavirus. So whilst, yes, Keir Starmer should be focused on coronavirus, there's nothing wrong with outsourcing that particular job to clear the air on this and to make sure that Nadine Dorries has to face more consequences than getting this most minor slap on the wrist that says you have to check the validity of information before tweeting a far-right account.
I mean, come on, Sir Keir. Ring, ring. Pondicata ruck.
I thought he was a prosecutor. Aaron, what do you think about this?
No, I agree with you. I think they should have made an example of her. You need to create what we'd call an electric fence. So just do not share ridiculous things about Keir Starmer, because you know what happens to Nadine Dorries. She ended up in court and she had to publicly apologise. I mean, at the very least, she shouldn't be a member of the cabinet. You know, at the very least, a member of the cabinet should not be publicly libeling the leader of the opposition. You would hope there'd be greater consequences than what she suffered in a liberal democracy. You would hope. But alas, no. But I agree with you from the perspective of political strategy. I think it's an inastute thing to just ignore. It won't go away. It will keep on happening. Keir Starmer's bet is that he'll be sufficiently Teflon to deal with it. I mean, I think that's partially true. I mean, what's interesting is you watch that video and you go, wow, this guy is a knight of the realm. He's the former head of the DPP, and he comes across so measured and so dull, right? Which is what you want in a DPP. You want a sort of quite a straight down the line procedural bureaucrat. Effectively, you're administering a really important part of the state.
You don't want Jeff Goldblum, is what you're trying to say.
But even this guy, who couldn't be more dour, you know, these lunatics like Nadine Dorries have to present as kind of this unhinged leftist. Like, he's happy with grooming. It's like this person, his personality couldn't be, and I have political misgivings about Keir Starmer in a range of areas. He couldn't be further away from what you're trying to present him as. So I think, and this is going to be a real corrective to a lot of people. You saw James O'Brien saying, oh, they're attacking him because he really dismantled Boris Johnson at PMQs. No, they will do this to any Labour leader. Ed Miliband, Gordon Brown. People forget they did it with Tony Blair. At the beginning of Tony Blair's leadership of the Labour Party, his son went to the Oratory School. It's a grant-maintained school. It's not a public school in London. And the right-wing media tried to tear him apart. And he was actually really personally hurt by the whole thing. Sherry Blair far more so. They will try, and John Major was just so bad ultimately, and Blair was actually pretty good. It didn't really wash. But they're going to try this again and again and again with Keir Starmer. And like I say, his bet is he can push back on it. But we have to remember, Tony Blair, the mid-90s, was a very different technological era. And like you say, we don't know the extent to which this goes through WhatsApp and back channels and so on. Those aren't public-facing media. And so I think you're absolutely right. He should have made an example of her.
Fox is just correcting us. She's not a cabinet minister, but she is a minister. So she's a junior minister.
She's on the front bench.
She's on the front bench, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the difference here is that if this was Jeremy Corbyn, then you would have had some Labour backbenchers tweet it, and then it would have become a news story because no one in the mainstream media would have had any interest in debunking it. Whereas because it's Keir Starmer and they think he's a respectable politician, they will rally around him in a way that they never did with the previous leader of the Labour Party, who had, you know, smeary videos tweeted about him all the time, and they would always become a big news story because it would be Labour backbenchers that would force it onto the front pages because people say, well, if Labour MPs think it's serious, then it must be serious.
But also, don't forget, right? Corbyn's chances in 2017 after 2 years of being traduced in the media, and Corbyn's chances in 2019 after 4 years of being traduced in the media were two very different things. 2017, he nearly becomes prime minister. 2019, it is electoral decimation. So in terms of how Keir Starmer should play this, it's, does he want to intervene when there is perhaps less leniency for him in the media, when perhaps for whatever reason there could be more, you know, factional infighting in the Labour Party, or much more, you know, aggressive styles of interrogation at PMQs, you know, or does he want that kind of, you know, underground far right media ecology to have reached a tipping point before he intervenes? I'm of the view of nip it in the bud, make an example of Nadine Dorries, and it means you can tackle these things absolutely head on, and you do it at a time when you have the most media support that you will probably ever have as leader of the opposition, even from, you know, newspapers like The Telegraph. You know, you can't bank on that 2, 3, 4 years down the line. And for Labour leaders who have, you know, held on to the leadership for the bulk of a full parliamentary term, it's been pretty bleak when it comes to recent elections. So for me, it's a matter of strategy. It's not a matter of Keir Starmer's politics. And I understand that he wants to come across as rising above the fray, as statesman-like, with a sense of perspective. But I think that this could grow very ugly. I think that it will grow very ugly. And I think that he has to crack down as hard as he can, as soon as he can.
Couldn't agree more. We've lost Michael Walker, so I'm going to lead you out for this evening show, guys. Thank you for watching, and thank you in particular for the super chats. If you want to,
Nadine Dorries got him. He said too much.
Yeah, possibly. It could be somebody on the alt-right using alt-tech. If you want to support us directly, you can go to novaramedia.com/support. Unfortunately, we don't have time for audience questions this evening. We've gone 15 minutes over, but I'm very glad we did, because I think we had around 1,600 people watching at the peak, but we didn't have 1,000 likes. If you can smash the like button, I'd really appreciate it. Ash, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Also, I've just seen that someone has left a $9.99 super chat to buy James a drink for his birthday, which is next week, our favourite tourist who helms the burner. So thank you very much, Fret Buzz Bill. We will be, I guess, getting him some kind of socially distanced Negroni. He likes the Negroni.
Yeah,
my internet cut out there, but are we
Michael,
outroing now?
Well, the outro, we're meant to do 15-second outros, but it's now become 90 seconds. Michael, you do the last. You do the sentence. It's your show. I hope everybody has a good weekend.
It was a chaotic end to the show, but I thought it was a very good hour and 15 minutes before that. You've been watching Tisky Sow. You've been watching Novara Media. Aaron and Ash, you've both been great. Have a wonderful weekend. We'll be back on Monday night. Good night.